Okay. The story you're about to hear is one of the most incredible in the history of UFO encounters. The abduction of Betty and Barney Hill is undoubtedly the world's best-known story of human beings encountering extraterrestrials and being taken by them. Although Betty and Barney have both passed away, Betty's niece, Kathleen Marden, keeps the amazing story alive by speaking all over the world about her aunt's experience. A highly acclaimed UFO researcher and researcher of alien abductions in her own right, Kathleen will now share with us her special, unique insight into what really happened to Betty and Barney on that fateful night in 1961. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Betty Hill's niece, Kathleen Marden.
Thank you, and thank you so much for coming today. It's my pleasure to share my family's experience with you. I was 13 years old when my Aunt Betty Hill called my mother, who was her younger sister. It was the afternoon of September 20th, 1961, and Betty told my mother Janet that she and my Uncle Barney had had a very strange experience the night before as they were returning home from a short vacation to Niagara Falls and up to Montreal in Canada. And that's what I'm going to tell you about today. What happened to them and my history in all of this as well. In the year 1990, I had left my job as a teacher and education services coordinator. I'd started out actually as a social worker and moved on to education during a recession and had worked for many years as an educator. I developed chronic mononucleosis, and as a result of that, I could no longer work full-time. So I was attempting to determine what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I had enjoyed writing about model education programs that I had developed, and I thought that since my aunt and uncle's experience that had such a huge impact on my own life, that I would now devote my time to researching this, to investigating this on my own, and to writing about it. And so I set out in 1990 to do this. My Aunt Betty worked cooperatively with me for many, many years. She turned over 40 years of investigative files to me. The original investigation reports, letters to and from scientists, the scientific analysis of the evidence. I continued with that research after my aunt passed away. She gave me the hypnosis tapes that she and my Uncle Barney had recorded during their 6 months of separate hypnosis with Dr. Benjamin Simon, a renowned psychiatrist in Boston, Massachusetts. And all of this, along with my own investigation, came together to become the book Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. Now, before my Aunt Betty died in 2004, she said to me, Kathy, if you need any help at all with this book, I would recommend that you speak to Stanton Friedman. She respected him highly. She knew that he was a meticulous researcher, and he had been instrumental in the work that was done on the star map that she drew as the result of a post-hypnotic suggestion by Dr. Benjamin Simon. So when the time came, I had the book nearly written. I went to Mr. Friedman, and I asked him if he would be interested in helping me by writing the chapters on the star map. It was something that I didn't want to spend several years investigating on my own. And he told me at that time that he would be interested, but he wanted to look at my papers, he wanted to read my manuscript, and that he would travel to my home in Stratham, New Hampshire at that time. I now live in Florida, but he lived in New Brunswick, Canada, still lives there. And in the fall of that year, he drove down and spent several days with my husband and myself at our home. He reviewed my work and told me that he was impressed by the fact that I had done a meticulous job in my research, that I had an eye for accuracy, and at that point he agreed to join me in continuing to vet my work and also in writing those chapters. So it all came together in this book, and that I'll talk to you about today. But first, let me introduce you to my aunt, Betty Hill. She was a social worker in the state of New Hampshire. She worked in child welfare and adoption, and eventually she was promoted to the position of supervisor in the state. She also wrote one book about her experience, not very much, but her ongoing experiences. That was published in 1995. And she traveled and spoke about her experience, too, for many years after she retired from social work. She was also a lifelong activist in the civil rights movement, always an advocate of human rights. My Uncle Barney served in the U.S. Army during World War II. He was injured. He was honorably discharged. I guess I should move forward. Okay. And after he was released and recovered from his injuries during the war, he took a job at the post office in Philadelphia. He worked there for many years, married, had 2 sons, and then he and his wife were divorced. He met my Aunt Betty when he was visiting in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and they found that they had a lot in common. They had never intended to marry. They became good friends, and eventually it developed into a romantic relationship, and they married in the year 1960, a little more than a year before their abduction experience. So, he was also active in civil rights, obviously. Barney was active in politics, too. He campaigned for Lyndon Johnson's inauguration. He was a delegate in the state of New Hampshire. And this is our invitation, because I went with them, because I was campaigning as well, when I was a high school student. And we were all invited to Lyndon Johnson's inauguration. We attended that in Washington, D.C. And what you see to the left is Barney with State Senator Thomas McIntyre in New Hampshire. Barney was given a citation in the state of New Hampshire for work that he had done through the Office of Economic Opportunity, where he worked to set up the Rockingham County Community Action Program and served as its first chairman of the board of directors. He was also appointed by the governor of the state to serve on the U.S. Civil Rights Commission State Advisory Committee. And I want you to know this because I want you to know the kind of people that my aunt and uncle were. So often, they're portrayed by skeptics and debunkers as a couple of nuts, really. And that's not the type of people that they were at all. Psychological testing that was done on my aunt and uncle indicated that they were perfectly normal. My uncle tested normal with strong intellectual abilities. His IQ was 140. My aunt tested normal, but she was more poised and independent than most. Psychiatrists who examined them said that there were no psychiatric problems. This lecture is going to be divided into two parts. First, we're going to talk about their conscious recall of the night of September 19, 1961. And the second part is going to be about what they didn't consciously recall. And that's going to be what was recovered through hypnosis. And we're also going to get into the evidence and the scientific analysis of the evidence. Well, on September 17, 1961, Betty and Barney left on an impromptu vacation to Niagara Falls and on to Montreal. Betty had a week's vacation from her job with the state, and Barney wanted to surprise her with a trip. And if you will look over here, you can follow their route from Niagara Falls up to Montreal. They spent the night about 112 miles away from Montreal, traveled on to Montreal, and spent the afternoon there. They thought about spending the night, but they heard that there was a hurricane coming up the coast, and so they decided to leave early, and they would drive home. They thought that they would arrive at their home on New Hampshire's seacoast at about 2 o'clock in the morning. And this is the route that they took. You can see Montreal down through upstate New Hampshire. They stopped in Colebrook for a snack. My husband and I actually traveled this entire route on the roads, the old back roads now that Betty and Barney traveled on back in 1961. And I wanted to see how long it actually took to drive those routes and how we felt. We were, 25 years older than Betty and Barney were when they took that route. And we discovered that we made it fine at our ages. And so I was testing skeptics' claims that Betty and Barney were so tired that they were actually hallucinating this UFO. And what I determined is that that was nonsense. So this is an old map of the state of New Hampshire, the northern route. And you can see Colebrook, where they stopped. They left Colebrook at 10 o'clock in the evening, and they headed south. The next town was Lancaster. That was 35 miles away. And just south of Lancaster, Betty spotted a new light in the sky. And it caught her eye because it seemed to move very rapidly upward and stopped beside the moon. And then it started to grow larger and larger and larger in the sky. You can see down here is Twin Mountain. It was 4 miles south of Twin Mountain where she convinced my Uncle Barney to stop and take a look at this thing. This is where they stopped, the Mount Cleveland picnic area. She had convinced Barney to walk the dog, and he got out of the car. She got out of the car with binoculars, and they looked up at this craft. It was still fairly distant at that time, but she saw it move across the face of the moon, flashing multicolored lights. My uncle took the binoculars, and he watched it as it traveled westerly toward Vermont, and then without looking as if it had turned at all, it suddenly came back very rapidly in his direction, and he could now see the lights in the craft, and it wasn't making any sound. He was very skeptical about flying saucers, is what they called them back then. He didn't think they were real, and so he was attempting to identify this as some kind of conventional craft. After they left, the Mount Cleveland picnic area, they traveled about 4 miles down to the entrance of Franconia Notch. And as they entered, they came upon Cannon Mountain. This was the old road they traveled on then. There's a new road here. But this is what they saw. The craft was at that time over the top of the mountain, and there's a lighted signal tower up here. It has a constant light, but as the craft passed over the top, the light blinked out. They made a second stop just south of that at the Old Man of the Mountain. And you can see this, oops, hang on. This is Profile Lake right here. The Old Man was right up here. The UFO was bouncing back and forth in the sky. And you can read what Betty wrote in a report about what they observed at that time. I want to tell you a little bit about the Old Man of the Mountain. The profile was 48 feet from forehead to chin. I say was because he fell off the mountain in 2003 into Profile Lake. When Betty and Barney looked up at the Old Man of the Mountain, there was the UFO next to the profile, and they said that it was at least 1.5 to 2 times the length of the Old Man's profile. And it appeared to be rotating. It was flashing lights at that time as if it were spinning, and they could see the blip, blip, blip as it moved around. They got back into the car, they headed south, and they exited Franconia Notch. And what they saw at that point was cabins in those days. It's now a beautiful resort, the Indian Head Resort. But this is the area where tourists would stay when they visited Franconia Notch. And Betty thought about stopping for the night at that point, and she and Barney decided that they were not tired. They would continue to drive on home. And then Betty was becoming very excited, too, because this craft was moving in closer and closer. She wanted Barney to stop again. So he started to look for a place to stop. And as he was looking, suddenly the craft surged ahead and stopped about 200 feet over the highway. Barney had to stop the car directly in the middle of the road, straddling the yellow line, the center line. And then the craft started to descend in their direction. Barney took the binoculars and a gun that he had placed in his pocket when he was at Mount Cleveland picnic area. He did that because he thought there were bears in the area, not because of the craft. But he was concerned at that point. He put it in his pocket. He got out, and he walked toward an adjacent field where it moved to. He stood in the field. He looked up at this craft through his binoculars, and he saw figures aboard the craft. They were dressed in black, shiny uniforms, and he stated that they were somehow not human. There was one that stayed at the window. There was this lighted row of windows, and an intense blue-white light was showing through the windows. The one made eye contact with Barney and frightened him terribly. The others went to a panel in the back of the hallway that seemed to encircle this craft. He could then see them from the tops of their heads down to their knees. He said that they seemed to be the size of a pencil at arm's length. So you can get kind of an idea of what he could observe, imagine what you would observe from a body at that point, at that distance. Well, when their arms went up in the air, something started to drop down from underneath the craft. And there were sort of like bat-wing type little projections that came out of the sides of this circular craft. And they had a red light on each end, and the craft started to tip toward him. He was afraid that he was going to be captured like a bug in a net. Those were his words. And he tried to break away and to run back to the car. And with great difficulty he did. He pulled the binoculars down from his eyes, breaking the leather strap in the process. Ran to the car, screaming to Betty that they had to get out of there or they were going to be captured. He jumped into the car and he started speeding down the highway. But as he was running back to the car, he noticed that the craft seemed to be following him. He told Betty to roll down the window, to look up, to see if she could see it. She was expecting to see lights. She didn't see lights. All she saw was blackness, a black void, even though it was a bright night. The waxing gibbous moon was nearly 3/4 full at that point. She put the window back up, and all of a sudden, she and my uncle started to hear a series of code-like buzzing sounds that seemed to be striking the trunk of their car. Their dog Dulcie was in the back seat, and it seemed to be hurting Dulcie's ears. The next thing they knew, the car was vibrating, and a tingling sensation was passing through their bodies. And then they found themselves 35 miles down the road. They had very little memory of what had happened in the interim. They did recall a fiery orb in the road. It was moving, but they weren't moving. They did recall a roadblock. They didn't know when or where it occurred. They wanted human contact. They started driving. They started talking. They heard another series of buzzing sounds on the trunk of the car. And then they drove on home to Portsmouth. When they arrived, it wasn't 2 o'clock in the morning. It was now 5 o'clock in the morning. And even accounting for those 3 stops that they made, they could not figure out how they had lost all that time. At that point, they didn't realize that it was a full, at least 2 to 3 hours. They just knew that they were very late. And something was wrong. First of all, they were afraid that they had been exposed to contaminants, to radiation. My aunt told my uncle to leave the luggage on the back porch of the house, not to take it in. They had a cooler with food. Throw the food away. Take long showers. They did all of these things, and then they went to bed. You can see their route home. Here's the state of New Hampshire. Different stops along the way. It was 277 miles that they drove that day from 112 miles west of Montreal to their home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. This is their home in Portsmouth. And this is some of the evidence. Barney's best dress shoes were so badly scuffed that he had to buy new shoes. He could not recall how he could possibly have done this, driving and sightseeing on this trip. Betty's favorite dress was torn in several locations. There was a 2-inch tear in the stitching. There was a 1-inch tear in the thick zipper fabric. The dress was torn from waist to hemline on the lining, and the hem was torn down on one side. There were shiny spots on the trunk of the vehicle. That is not a photograph of them. I created that. We didn't think and the investigators did not think to photograph it at that time. I was a witness. I saw these spots. I knew what they looked like. They caused a compass needle to spin and spin when it was placed over them, meaning that there was a magnetic field in that area. And those are in the area where they heard those buzzing sounds as the UFO hovered overhead. Their watches that had been running just fine the previous evening had stopped and never ran again. They sat down and they drew a sketch of what they recalled from that night. Now remember, Betty did not look at those beings through binoculars. It was only Barney who had conscious recall of observing non-humans aboard the craft. So here's Betty's sketch. You can see Barney's, you can see the figures. This is when it was 200 feet above the car. This is when it was about 100 feet above the field. On the advice of my father's best friend, who was the former chief of police of Newton, New Hampshire, Betty and Barney made a report, a Project Blue Book report, to Pease Air Force Base. In the report, it said that at arm's length, that UFO was as large as a dinner plate during its closest approach to their car. It was huge. Betty became very interested in all of this. She had never read a book on UFOs before. She had never had a serious interest in the subject, but she went to the Portsmouth Public Library and found a book to read on the topic. And it was The Flying Saucer Conspiracy by Major Donald Kehoe, who was the National Director of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena in Washington, D.C. And she sat down and wrote a letter to him after she read the book. And this is the letter that you can see, and I will come to part of that. Now, 10 days after Betty and Barney's arrival home from this trip, Betty had a series of 5 dreams, or nightmares. She reconstructed these in November of that year and wrote them down with her typewriter. She typed out a report. It was a 5-page report. And she arranged these dreams in what she thought might have been sequential order. She thought there might be some significance to them. They told of the sighting that they had. They told of their arrival back on the highway on Route 3 with the second series of buzzing sounds. But sandwiched in between those was a very strange encounter with alien beings and a physical examination. Betty had only 5 dreams. Barney thought they were nonsense. He didn't want to hear about them. This is Walter Webb. He was the first investigator on their case. He was a NICAP investigator. He was an astronomer at the Hayden Planetarium in Boston. And he went to Betty's and Barney's home on September 21st, 1961 to interview them. He interviewed them together and separately for a period of 6 hours. He wrote his report on September 26th. This is part of Walter's report, and I'm going to move over to read it. He said that the approaching UFO finally filled up the entire field of the binoculars. The leader at the window held a special attraction for the witness and frightened him terribly. The witness, meaning Barney, said he could almost feel the figure's intense concentration to do something, to carry out a plan. He said Mr. Hill believed that he was going to be captured like a bug in a net. That is when he knew it was no conventional aircraft he was observing, but something alien and unearthly containing beings of a superior type, beings that were somehow not human. And this is C.D. Jackson and Robert Homan. After Walter Webb's investigation, they visited Betty and Barney. This was in November of 1961. They were also members of NICAP. C.D. Jackson was a senior engineer for IBM, and Robert Homan was a scientific writer for the same company. They took a very keen interest in this case. And this is the timeline of events. Of course, the top one is the date of the event itself. September 21st, they reported it to the Air Force. On the 26th, to NICAP. Then Betty's dreams came, and then Walter's interview. And then on March 12, 1962, they went to visit Dr. Quirk, who was a psychiatrist who did hypnosis down in Massachusetts. He examined them. He thought they were fine. And he said to them, I don't want to do hypnosis right now, because I think if you just give this some time, more memories will emerge, and you'll be able to remember what happened. In November of 1962, Betty and Barney had a meeting with a colonel in intelligence, a research engineer, a navigator, a hypnotist, and a minister. And actually, this is the hypnotist from Pease Air Force Base, Ben Sweat. He retired as a full colonel from the Air Force, and I had the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. to interview him about 4 or 5 years ago about his memories of this experience, too. He was convinced that it was real. Betty and Barney wondered if he might hypnotize them, but he said no. He thought that given the magnitude of this experience and the emotional impact that it was apparently having on not only Betty, but more so on Barney, he recommended that they see a professional. And eventually, they were referred to Dr. Benjamin Simon, and they saw him for the first time in December of 1963. He was treating Barney for post-traumatic stress disorder, for bleeding ulcers. He had had some physiological problems that developed as a result of the terror he had experienced when he was standing in the field looking up at these non-humans and having to know that the tops of his shoes were so deeply scraped and not being able to remember all of what had happened, not remembering that 2 hours of missing time. Then Dr. Simon saw them. He treated them separately for a period of 6 months. He hypnotized them separately. He reinstated amnesia at the end of each session so that they could not compare notes. They couldn't remember what they had even stated. At the end of these sessions, he brought them together in the same room and let them listen to their separate statements under hypnosis. And that's when the therapy came in as they worked through what had happened. And their statements from their own individual perspective was nearly identical. So now we're going to get into the hypnosis and the evaluation of the evidence. This is Dr. Benjamin Simon. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Army during the World War II. He set up the psychiatric unit at the Mason General Hospital on Long Island in New York. He had a great deal of success in treating returning veterans for what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Back then, they called it shell shock. they also had hysterical symptoms where perhaps a soldier had seen his body have his head blown off in the trenches, had suddenly become blind, for example. And other psychiatrists had treated this soldier without success. Dr. Simon's success was because he used deep trance hypnosis to get to the root of the cause. And he would find out, what the example I'm giving you is true, that this particular soldier had received a Dear John letter from his girlfriend the week before. So not only did he read that letter, but then he had this tragic incident. And that is when he developed this psychophysical blindness. And Dr. Simon was able to work through that to help to restore his sight. And he had a great deal of success in working with returning soldiers, and the movie Let There Be Light was made about his work. So, let's see what happened. When Barney was standing in the field, and you know about that, he sketched this being looking down at him. And this is what he could remember, looking at this leader through binoculars. I did a comparative analysis on Betty's and Barney's statements under hypnosis. I wanted to know if Betty was actually repeating her dreams, and if Barney had merely absorbed the information in Betty's dreams and was repeating that and fantasizing about it and confabulating a story under hypnosis. So that was one of my objectives in my research. So let's see what we have. In Betty's dreams, she stated, I saw 8 to 11 men standing in the middle of the road. The men surrounded the car. Under hypnosis, she and Barney both stated that this group divided into 2 groups. They didn't surround the car. And 3 of them went to Barney's door, and 3 of them went to Betty's door. That was not in Betty's dream sequence. In Betty's dreams, she and Barney sat motionless. That's not what happened in hypnosis. Barney said to Betty, I think it's them again. The ones I saw in the field. He thought about going for his gun. As they started to approach the car, Betty became terrified. She started to open her door. She wanted to escape into the woods. But before she could, 3 of them came to her door and intercepted her. She, at that point, lost consciousness and then awoke as they were taking her on a path through the woods to a landed craft. Barney had stepped out of the car, put his foot on the ground when they intercepted him. These are the ETs in Betty's dreams, right here. These are the ETs that Barney described to Dr. Simon under hypnosis as a New Hampshire artist, David Baker, was painting and sketching what Barney described. So you can see that they look very much like what today we think of as grays. The only difference really is in the eyes. The artist who did these drawings stated in a letter that I have that his drawings were based upon his knowledge of human anatomy. So he didn't draw them exactly as Barney described them. Barney described beings with very spindly arms and legs and oversized heads and completely bald, with oversized chests. They were not rugged like the ones this artist drew. He also said that these wraparound large eyes had a lot of black in them, but some yellow around the edges. And they reminded Betty and Barney very much of cat's eyes. So I told you a little bit about Barney's description. He said that they were wide-cheeked, weak-chinned, with broad, flat faces. And Betty, by the way, agreed with all of this. They had no lips, immobility of the mouth. A membrane was observed inside their mouths. They had large slanted eyes that rounded the sides of their heads. They had a bluish-gray skin tone and were wearing shiny black uniforms. Well, Betty and Barney were taken through the woods by these ETs. Betty apparently was walking from her memory of this. Barney was not. Barney remembered feeling as if he was floating, but only the toes of his shoes were touching the ground, and they seemed to be bumping along these rocks. And then he could feel his feet slide up a ramp and bump over the top of something. And then he opened his eyes and he was being taken into a darkened hallway and into an examining room. Betty decided to fight. She didn't want to go on that craft. She had woken up and she gave the escort to her right a good swift kick. And that is how her dress was torn in 2 locations. They took control of her again and took her onto the craft and into the examining room, a separate one from Barney. Well, after the hypnosis, they were able to draw this sketch. You can see Barney's sketch here of what he remembered. He drew this under hypnosis. They found the spot where they were captured in 1965. It's the only place like it. So that's what it looked like where they were captured. Now let's get to what happened on the craft. There's a darkened hallway, an artist's rendition of what they saw as they went in. Betty said that there were 2 groups of grays. There was one that was about 3.5 to 4 feet tall, head much larger in proportion to its body than the others, and its eyes were black. The other group was the taller group that I described. She was taken into an examining room. She had her exam first. She was first seated in what looked like something like a dentist's chair. They looked at her skin, they looked into her eyes, they took samples from different openings in her body. And then, when they were finished with that, they placed her on a table. They produced a large needle, and she said, "What are you going to do with that?" And he said, "We're just going to put it in your navel. It's a simple test." And this was telepathic communication, by the way. And she said, "No, it will hurt." And he then plunged that needle into her navel. And Dr. Simon actually had to end her hypnosis session early. She was experiencing so much pain at that point. But the leader took her pain away. He put his hand up near her temple or over her eyes. He thought he flashed it over her eyes, and all the pain went away. As an abduction researcher, I hear this over and over again today. The smaller ETs, the ones who waited in the hallway, are the escorts. They are the guards. They make sure that you don't get off the craft with anything that belongs to them. They might help to get you dressed and undressed, and they don't do it very well. Sometimes they will dress you in somebody else's clothing. Sometimes they'll put your clothing inside out or backwards. If they're taking you from your bedroom, sometimes they'll put your feet on your pillow and your head tucked tightly into the bottom of your bed. So they make a lot of mistakes. And then the taller ones, the examiner, the one that Betty called the leader, I now call the personal escort, because experiencers see this person over and over again throughout a lifetime. That person has a personal relationship. It's his job to calm the experiencer, to communicate with the experiencer, to take away the pain if any pain is inflicted during the medical examinations and the different tests. It's not just the exams that Betty and Barney had. It's a lot more sophisticated today in what they do. And now we'll get to Barney's hypnosis. He was placed on a table, and his trousers were pulled down to his knees. His shoes were removed. They paid special attention to Betty's and Barney's feet, to their hands, to their joints, to their skeletal structure. They examined their vertebrae. They seemed very, very interested in the difference between our skeletal structure and our nervous system and their own. So that was what Betty and Barney thought was the major focus of their examination. They also placed a cup-like device over Barney's groin and extracted semen. They probably extracted ova from Betty when they plunged the needle into her navel. We know today that that seems to be what is happening, and many, many experiencers have observed fetuses in various stages of development in gestational tanks on board craft. When Barney's exam was being carried out, Betty was left alone in the examining room with the one that she called the leader. And she had lost her fear of him because he had taken her pain away. And so she said to him, "I know you're not from around here. Where are you from?" And he produced this star map. It appeared to be three-dimensional, and there were many stars on it. Some were as large as nickels. Others were pinpoints. And there were lines connecting some. Some were solid lines that she understood as representing trade routes. Others were dotted lines that she thought were expeditions. Under hypnosis with Dr. Simon, he gave Betty the post-hypnotic suggestion that if she could remember this accurately, she would draw it. And within the next couple of weeks, she did. And this became the basis for the investigation of the star map. Marjorie Fish was the researcher. She was a brilliant woman from the state of Ohio. She was a school teacher at the time, and she thought that if she had actually read The Interrupted Journey, she was skeptical about this, but she thought if it existed in our neighborhood, she might be able to identify these stars on the map. And so her investigation began. And in that time frame, of course, we didn't have photocopy machines. She had to go to Ohio State University, and she had to go to the astronomy department and sit there and copy all of the distance data for the nearby stars in our local galactic neighborhood out 55 light years. Remarkable work she did. Starting in 1968, she built 26 three-dimensional models of our local galactic neighborhood, and still she could not find a match. It took her 4 years to find one, and in one of these star models that she built, she had 256 stars in their proper location. Imagine the math to figure out where to put every single star, different colored beads of different sizes on monofilament line. And I'm going to show you what it looked like in a minute. Finally, in 1972, she found a match when a new catalog was published with new distance data. And we then discovered that there were 3 stars on Betty's map that she didn't have distance data for, and that's when she found the match in 1972 after we acquired this data. So this is Marjorie's, the photograph of Marjorie's pattern stars. and this is her identification. Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli were the stars that she thought the ETs came from. They're in the southern hemisphere in the constellation Reticulum, the net. You can only see them from the southern hemisphere. And you can see our sun up here. They're about 39.2 light years away. They're an eighth of a light year apart. There's been some controversy about whether or not they could have planets that would remain in a stable orbit. Many scientists think that they could. Some of the facts about Marjorie's work. All the pattern stars are sun-like, although only 5% of the 1,000 stars in our local galactic neighborhood out 54 light years are sun-like stars. And most of the stars are not sun-like. And all the sun-like stars in that volume of space on the map are in the pattern. That was quite remarkable. It convinced many scientists that Betty and Barney's experience was real. Even today, after all of this time, this was recently updated by a young astrophysicist. You can do a search on YouTube and find it, or write to me if you can't, and I'll give you the URL. But even today, that map is about 89% accurate, using today's distance data. So let's get into the scientific analysis of Betty's dress, and I need to check my watch. Ooh. Okay, so here's Betty's dress. You can see it was blue originally, and it was discolored. She took her dress, she placed it in her closet. She knew it needed to be repaired. The next time she took it out, she found this pink powdery substance that discolored her dress and degraded the fiber of the fabric. It reduced her dress to a rag. She was going to throw it away, but she decided to keep it because she thought it might hold a clue to what had happened. So she kept the dress for many, many years, and finally someone was interested in doing a scientific analysis on it. And I want to show you the pink here has completely saturated the sleeves on her dress. And this is where she said that these ETs grasped her around her shoulders and the tops of her arms and held her tightly as they escorted her along the path. This is the results of some of the analyses that have been done on Betty's dress. In 1977, the University of Cincinnati stated that the pink is strange in relation to its inorganic elemental compound and that it's high in organic hydrocarbons. They did many, many tests on that dress. They attempted to create that same pink by using a variety of different chemicals. Nothing could reproduce that effect on Betty's dress. Then in 1980, an anonymous scientist said that there were no pollen or spores, microorganic material on the dress. So it didn't seem to be mold that caused that. In the year 2000, the Pinelandia Biophysics Laboratory did a bioassay test. They planted seeds in petri dishes, and they had part of the pink part of the dress, the blue part of the dress, and then just plain water. And what they did is they ground up the pink part of the dress, and they put it in some water, and they soaked it. And then the same with the blue, and then plain water. And those seeds that were watered with the pink part of the dress grew at an extraordinarily fast rate and very, very large. And so the scientists who did this thought that this was very unusual. This is Phyllis Budinger, who did the major chemical analysis on Betty's dress. She has a master's degree in chemistry. She worked for Standard Oil for many, many years, and BP Amoco for 35 years as an analytical chemist. It was her job to identify material substances that were not easily identifiable. So she was a perfect person to do this chemical analysis on Betty's dress. And this was done, it started in the year 2001, and she finally wrote her report, I believe it was in 2004. She concluded that the stained areas were coated with a biological material of mostly protein and a small amount of natural oil. The protein attacked the fiber and dye in the stained areas and broke down the fiber structure, and it came from an external source, not from Betty. So this was an anomalous finding. Her conclusion was that the chemical analysis supports Betty's account of the event. And I go into more detail in my book about all of this and limited in my time today, so sorry, but I can't get into all of the details with you. This study is very intriguing to me, an alien symbols study. Betty saw a book of sorts on the craft. As she described it to me, it sounds more like an iPad tablet today than a book. Inside that book, she saw rows, vertical rows of symbols that she thought was alien writing. In the year 2000, I asked Betty to sit down and from memory sketch what she could recall of those symbols. It took her a couple of weeks to do it, but she finally handed me the paper. I looked at them, and then I took them home and put them into a locked file and kept them in my files. I didn't show them to anybody, but when my book was published, I put them in the book. And Dr. Don Derry from McGill University, psychology professor, saw them in my book. I didn't know it, but in the year 2004, he had joined with Dr. Stuart Appel from the State University of New York, Rockport, and Bud Hopkins, and they did an alien symbol study. And in this study, they took symbols that Bud's experiencers had been sketching since 1975. They had two groups of graduate students. One was hypnotized and given a fantasy that they had been on board an alien craft and they saw symbols and they should sketch them. The other one's group of graduate students just sketched the symbols from memory, not from memory, but from imagination. And then all of these symbols were photocopied onto the same type of paper, and graduate students analyzed them. And what they discovered were that the graduate students' symbols were very, very different from the symbols drawn by Bud Hopkins' experiencers. And actually, there seemed to be two different types of alien writing in Bud's experiencers, which I also found very interesting. Well, Dr. Don Derry asked me about the possibility that he might see this original paper of Betty's, and photocopied it for him, and he did an analysis on her symbols. And what he discovered was the symbols Betty remembered and that were published for the first time in 2007 look remarkably like many of the symbols that Hopkins had been collecting from abductees since 1975. Just another piece of scientific evidence that this event was real. And here you can see Bud's experiences symbols, and you can see symbols that Betty sketched that were very, very similar. And let's get into the end now of the experience where Betty and Barney were released from capture. My analysis of Betty's dreams versus statements. In Betty's dream, she said, "We left the ship and walked through the woods. All the men accompanied us. The leader suggested that we wait and see them leave. We agreed. We stood on the right side of the car. That was it." That's not what Betty and Barney said to Dr. Simon separately under hypnosis. Barney was taken down the path by his escort first. The car door was open. He sat on the driver's seat and on his pistol. He's lucky it didn't go off. He said that the dog was cowering underneath as much far as she could get in, underneath the front seat, and he picked her up at that point. He didn't know where Betty was. He was already forgetting what had happened. Then he looked up, and there was Betty coming down the path, and she was being escorted by one ET. She had actually remained behind because she wanted to take that book with the symbols with her, and the leader told her she could. But as she went to leave the craft, that little guard, who's responsible for making sure you don't get off that craft, took the book away from her and said, "We've decided you can't have that." And so she was really, really angry and remained behind and was trying to get that book, and she didn't succeed. So as she was going down the path, she was saying to the leader, "I know you want me to forget this, but I will never, ever forget this happened to me as long as I live." And so then he took her and he said, "Well, we hope that you forget. It wouldn't be good for you to remember." And they took her down to the car, and then she and Barney watched the craft leave as it seemed to roll over again and again, become a bright red orb, and then take off. After the hypnosis, Dr. Simon told them if this was a real event, they would be able to find the capture spot, and they actually did in 1965. It was Labor Day weekend. I was with them, actually, my grandparents, and my mother was there as well. We'd gone camping for the weekend, and somehow we were driving along, and Barney just went by the right place. He remembered it. He drove in, and there it was. It was really a very exciting day for them to have found the spot. There's no place like this up in this area of New Hampshire. So they had found themselves over here on Route 175. They'd been over here on Route 3. Somehow they got here without realizing they'd turned. There was really no way they could have turned. I think that the craft probably picked their car up. Whoops, pushed the wrong button. This was sort of a logging road, a dirt road back then. There were the men in the road. They were taken to this sandy area where the craft had landed. Well, there was a violation of confidentiality in 1965, October of 65, and their story was published in a Boston newspaper. It ran for 5 nights in a row. Betty and Barney never wanted this to be told to the public. She had a job with the state of New Hampshire. He was active in politics. You can imagine the impact that this knowledge to the public would have on them. And they were very upset when this happened. But eventually they decided that since it had gone public and it wasn't as bad as they thought, they hadn't lost their jobs, that they would cooperate with John G. Fuller, who wrote the first book about their experience. The Interrupted Journey became a best-selling book in 1966. It was based primarily on the hypnosis. My book is Their Lives Before This, during the experience, the scientific evidence, and Betty's life beyond, after Barney's death. until her death. Well, you can see that Betty and Barney did not seem really thrilled as they were holding that newspaper for that photograph after it was published in the newspaper as a violation of confidentiality. And then after the book was published, a debunking effort was begun by Philip Klass, who was probably the 20th century's most leading anti-UFO propagandist. And he told many, many lies about Betty's and Barney's experience. And since then, they have been carried over again and again. He said that Betty was intensely interested in UFOs all of her life. That is false. She didn't develop an interest until after the experience occurred. He said she sounded as casual during the hypnosis as if she had been describing a trip to the supermarket. If you listen to the hypnosis tapes, you can hear Betty screaming, crying. When she was captured, she had never been so terrified in her entire life. Dr. Simon had to end one hypnosis session early due to the degree of trauma she was experiencing. Yet, in the skeptical media, it's told the way that Philip Klass stated it. And that's why I do what I do, because I want the public to know the truth about this. He said the compass acted perfectly all right to Barney. I suppose if you place a compass over a shiny spot on the trunk of the car and it spins and spins, is that normal? No, it's not. It's an indication that there's a magnetic field. But he said that it didn't do anything. And that's been carried through the skeptical media as well. And he said that all of the details that Betty remembered were found in Barney's account. That is false as well. And in fact, I have a different lecture that I present that's based primarily on the debunking campaign against Betty's and Barney's story. Interesting, Betty and Barney engaged in some experiments with Robert Hohman and C.D. Jackson, who I introduced earlier, the two men from IBM. And they had a scientific team. They had the idea that they would do psychophysics experiments. So they scripted Betty, and they would ask her to try to send these telepathic messages that they devised for UFOs to come in. She'd try to vector in the craft. And then a scientific team would go out and they would look to see if they could see the craft. And sometimes they did. In the end, though, they couldn't say that it was anything more than coincidence, because maybe, let me give you an example. One vectoring attempt was an attempt to bring a craft in near a street named Moccasin. And then they, in their research, found out that somewhere else in the United States, a craft was observed by somebody, and there was a street named Moccasin nearby. So they said, well, that was a coincidence, and they could not say that it was Betty who did this. But I believe that she did have some success, because during part of her vectoring attempts, she tried to get a craft to land on my grandparents' farm. And then one night, one actually did. It was observed by a commercial pilot who was on his way home. He lived in my neighborhood. It woke my grandparents up. They got up, they looked out their window at this craft that was down on the ground. It sheared off treetops as it came in. There was physical trace evidence on the ground. My grandmother had been kidding around with my Aunt Betty, and she said, well, if one actually lands, tell them to come knock on the door, and I'll invite them in for coffee. And you can imagine how frightened my grandmother was that night when she heard on her door. Now, we don't know if it was knocking or if it was the wind blowing, but she was very frightened when she heard those raps on her door and didn't want to go any further with that. There were very strange things that happened after that landing. We had never had paranormal activity in my childhood home, and I grew up across the street from my grandparents' farm. All of a sudden, we started to have things happen. We had things that would fly off from shelves. We observed orbs. One time, oh, I don't have much time left. I was going to very quickly tell you a story about when I was in college. I had a boyfriend who came home for the weekend. My brother was, it was during the Vietnam War, my brother was in the Army. So my boyfriend was sleeping in his bedroom. And in the middle of the night, we were awoken by his yelling. He had been lying in bed, the coat hangers lifted out of my brother's closet, flew across the room, and landed on top of him. He left that house and he wouldn't go back in. He almost broke up with me, but it lasted a little while longer than that. But we had a lot of very strange experiences that caused us to wonder if maybe those ETs thought that Betty had invited them to come and see the rest of the family. And we don't know that for sure, but very, very mysterious and perplexing. This was the Skywatch that Betty participated in Barney in 1967. Here you can see Robert Homan, C.D. Jackson. There's Betty. And this is my mother right here. Jacques Vallée was up in the top picture with his wife, former wife. She's deceased now, Janine. This is a photograph that Betty took of a UFO. She would go out looking for UFOs, try to vector them in. And so I got a couple of good photographs. She got a lot of lousy ones as well. And here's another one where you can actually see lights or windows. And update, in front of the Indian Head Resort in Lincoln, New Hampshire, the state of New Hampshire has erected a memorial marker. I worked for many years on this and finally succeeded on the 50th anniversary of their abduction event. And it states, on the night of September 19 and 20th, 1961, Portsmouth, New Hampshire couple, Betty and Barney Hill, experienced a close encounter with an unidentified flying object and 2 hours of lost time while driving south on Route 3 near Lincoln. They filed an official Air Force Project Blue Book report of a brightly lit cigar-shaped craft the next day, but were not public with their story until it was leaked in the Boston Traveler in 1965. This was the first widely reported UFO abduction report in the United States. So I was very proud of that. And if you ever get up to New Hampshire and you want to retrace their route, you can go to my website. My card is out at my table. You can go to the website. I have a self-guided tour there, and it describes everything, where to stop, and everything that occurred during that stop. So you'll be able to print that out and take it with you so you'll know exactly where to go. The marker is in front of the Indian Head Resort. And, okay, this is Bryce Zabel here. He's a Hollywood producer. He has purchased the option to do a movie on my book, and he's looking for funding now. I hope that someday it will become a movie. This is a photograph of me. I was MUFON's Ufologist of the Year in 2012, and I am also their International Director of Abduction Research. My website and the books and DVD that I have for sale. Let's see if we have any time. Oh, I guess we don't have time for questions, but I'd be very, very happy to take your questions out at my table. So thank you very, very much for coming to my lecture. Appreciate it.